So, for the next segment, I would like to come to the Russia Ukraine war. There are many people who claim that the remaining part of the Donbass is heavily fortified and that Russia will find it very difficult to break through it. And also, that might have a direct impact on the negotiations. So, according to you, what are the latest updates on the battlefield? And do you think this war will, like Professor Mearsheimer has put, be decisively decided on the battlefield?
There's I'm not a military expert, and I don't have the means in order to evaluate the military progress of the war on a daily basis as others do. But from what I know from the own sources that I follow, is that Russia is advancing bit by bit, and it is continuing. It was fighting a war of attrition. In it for 2 years, it was just grinding down NATO equipment, everything that NATO put into Ukraine and then put into use against Russia. They let it come on, and then they just destroyed it bit by bit. That's why the front lines weren't moving for the longest time after everything had settled into this war of attrition. Because the first phase of the war was different, right? In the first phase, Russia wanted to scare Ukraine into making a treaty of neutrality and accepting Russian terms. They tried that, but it failed because the West said Ukraine continue, and sent Boris Johnson to Kiev, said like, do not sign this document, and he never signed this document. Then they pushed back these troops. It was way not enough troops that they used in the beginning in Ukraine in order to have any reasonable chance at occupying Ukraine, which is why we know, and Vladimir Putin said so repeatedly, that the beginning was different. We wanted to scare them into creating that treaty with us. But then they had to withdraw. They fortified their lines, and then they fought this war of attrition for 2 years. And about half a year, 8-9 months ago, they started slowly moving forward in order to get all of these four oblasts that they want, and probably more. And currently, that onslaught, that slow steamroller that just moves forward is continuing, and that's the military arm of the Russian strategy. The other arm is that they're constantly saying we're also willing to come to a diplomatic to find a diplomatic solution. And Vladimir Putin said several times that they're going to do both at the same time. But that's mainly why they are not agreeing to a ceasefire. The West says, oh, look, they're so evil, they don't want peace. That's why they don't want a ceasefire, because a ceasefire has to come first, and then you get to a peace agreement. And the Russians said, like, look, that's what we did last time with Minsk. We time and again believed that you were serious about a peace process, and we stopped all military measures, just in order to be fooled and then have be attacked at a later point. So this time, that's not what we're doing. This time, what we do is like we do a dual track approach, military and political. And if the political one fails, then we will fall back on the military one. And the fact that they are moving forward, the fact that they are slowly winning the war, only strengthens their political hand, right? And we are back in a moment of Mr. Clausewitz, Karl von Clausewitz, who famously coined the phrase of a war being the continuation of politics by other means. So Russia is very much implementing that at the moment. And the hope from their side was recently, with the meeting in Anchorage and so on, that maybe they can come to an agreement with the United States, because the US is the main driver of the war, because the actual conflict is between Russia and the US that tries to implement a proxy war against Russia, and Russia that pushes back. And they are aware that if you have a some form of understanding with the US, the Ukraine will be almost obliged to follow. Now, the agreement that has been made in Anchorage is not public. We don't know what exactly the understanding is, and it's not an agreement. It's not anything written. It is certainly only some kind of team to team discussion and a nodding off of like maybe the basic principles of the US Russian relationship going forward from here, but it's definitely not one in which the US would be willing to just give up its interests in Ukraine. So, and plus the Europeans who encourage the Americans to continue the war, because they are the Europeans are at the moment the most ardent opponents to a peace in Ukraine that is not their vision of peace. And their vision of peace is Ukraine gets back all of its territories, including Crimea, and Vladimir Putin gets a war criminal trial in The Hague. Now, for understandable reasons, that's not something that Russia will agree to. Just won't happen. Therefore, the Europeans say, like, in that case, we need to continue pushing because we need to win. um, the tragedy of it, of course, for Ukraine being that they're the implementation partner of this proxy war, and they're the ones who do the bleeding for the other ones, the Europeans, who do the pushing. But that's the general atmosphere that we're in at the moment. But what I see happening now is that we are basically deadlocked on the political front. So there was momentum about 3 weeks ago during the Anchorage meetings, but that momentum has faded away, and the Europeans are in complete turmoil, and they're trying to sabotage any such moves toward a proper security agreement with the Russians. And the Americans seem not keen very much on moving forward on a proper security agreement and on addressing what Russia calls the root causes of the war. Because the Russians still they want a agreement of how to stabilize and the European continent, and how to make sure that they cannot be attacked anymore, right? And how to make sure that we have an overall peaceful environment, because this kind of constant insecurity with NATO is really the main concern and the existential crisis for Russia. Now, if the West is not willing to move forward on that, then Russia says that it's quite simple. We just continue with our military strategy, and at least in Ukraine, then create militarily a cordon sanitaire, a kind of security buffer zone. First, we get the oblasts, the four oblasts, and maybe a little bit more, and we put that into Russia, and where we can directly control it, and then the rest we create some form of military buffer, from which Russia can do what Israel does in its immediate neighborhood, bombing anything that looks slightly threatening at will. So this is not the optimal outcome for Russia, but it is a possible way of dealing with this existential crisis for Russia. So they are continuing that, and at the moment, it looks as if that's the outcome that we are going toward. Although it is difficult to see how this is really not an optimal outcome, and it is not a stable outcome, and it is not one that will hold for forever. So the question still is, what in the end will be the political solution? Because at some point you need a document on which the different sides sign and say, fine, this is how we go forward. You cannot live constantly with such a militarized border. I think the only exception that we have seen to this is North and South Korea, which managed to settle in around a highly militarized border. But it takes 60, 70, 80 years for this to become a stable situation. Any absent such a trajectory, it will be more violence again in the future from one side or the other.
So, given that the Europeans are sabotaging the peace process, my question would be, why would President Trump agree to US security guarantees? Because I'm sure he would know that this is going to be unacceptable for Russia. And also, since you study neutrality in IR, it would be best to ask you, would a neutral Ukraine be acceptable for Russia? And also, how would Ukraine accept neutrality without, knowing that they won't be attacked in the future by Russia?
So the answer to the second part of your question is very easy. Yes, Russia would not only accept a neutral Ukraine, Russia demands a neutral Ukraine. It has been their offer back in 2022. It has been their idea before 2022 and 2021. In December 2021, they sent two draft treaties to Washington and to Brussels. Same draft treaty, copies of it to NATO headquarters and to Washington, saying like, look, this is the kind of security and the security structure that we propose for Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And it said it didn't use the word neutrality for Ukraine, but it described it in all but the word that Ukraine has to be can have a military and is a sovereign nation, but it cannot be a threat and it cannot be a NATO staging ground against Russia. So it has no NATO membership. It's and it is not being supported by NATO states. It has a limit on its military capacities. All of that was in there. Just the word neutrality wasn't in there. Then we get all of this escalation. We get to the full out invasion in February, and then in end of March, beginning of April, the agreement that they come up with and that they almost sign actually includes the word neutrality. It says like Ukraine will be a neutral state and no NATO membership, neutral and non-aligned. And even 3 years later, the Russians still want that. The most recently in their talks, they still say in order to come to a final peace agreement, Ukraine needs to accept neutrality. So the Russians want it. Because it creates that security for them that they cannot be attacked through Ukraine and that this border cannot be used in order to wreak havoc inside Russia. They want that. The ones who don't want that is still the Europeans. And the Americans are also still not willing to sign off on anything like that, because we must understand at this point, the Ukraine is a client state, and especially a client state of the US. And there's the structural power that the US has through the funding that it gave to Ukraine and through the networks and also the NGO networks and everything inside Ukraine that already managed to get out in 2014 the elected president Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-neutralist president, and replace him with an anti-neutralist president and an anti-Russian leadership. That kind of power structure is still there. So, from the optics of the United States, what is still the still Ukrainian part of Ukraine is firmly in their sphere of interference. And why would they give it up, right? So why give up something that you've got? So we are kind of deadlocked on that part. The question is whether this will change and whether the Americans at some point will accept that, okay, fine, so-called neutralization of Ukraine is necessary in order to end this and to have whatever it is like that you want to obtain in the future. And then for Ukraine, the question is whether they will find a way to accept that their indoctrinated neutrality from the outside is actually good for them. And we've seen moments in history when that happens, that you have a former very bellicose state that slowly but steadily transforms into a reliable neutral. Sweden once upon a time was a very successful like warfaring state. It was not an empire, but it was one of the great powers before the 19th and before the 18th century. And that glory went away, that warfaring capacity all went away, although they were always well militarized, but they slowly transformed into using this policy of neutrality in order to maintain their security. And it would certainly take time, and it will certainly take a change of leadership, because under Mr. Zelensky, there's no way that this is imaginable. But let's say if there was a genuine change, political change in Ukraine, and the realization, not just of parts, but of large parts of the population, that the only way to get out is to actually be neutral, then I could imagine a future in which Ukraine says, okay, we will be neutral and we will defend that neutrality, and neutrality saves us from being a toy of international politics. Because at some point I do hope that also the large part of Ukrainians understands just how much they were used and how much they were bled dry by the West, by the people who said, we are here to protect you, they were pushing them into the bayonets. If that realization sets in large parts of the population, there might be this moment when they say like neutrality will keep us safe. And if that happens, then we might get closer to a moment when the Ukrainians themselves want to uphold neutrality, which is of course a requirement for a stable neutrality. You cannot make a country neutral against its will, unless the realization sets in.
So, how would Ukraine also accept a neutral status without European security guarantees or US security guarantees?
Ah,
Would be my question.
right. The first part of your question, and it's a good one. So, the security guarantees are a no-starter for the Russians. They are saying that if security guarantees, then we also want to provide some. Right? Ukraine needs to be neutral, and if ever it wants to have military escapades, then the Russians need a veto over such things. Um, Also, like the troops, right? The security guarantees in the sense of peacekeepers in Ukraine, peacekeepers, those will of course be NATO troops in Ukraine. That's also a no-go. So any discussion about that is pure hot air. It has nothing to do with any kind of engagement with the Russian demands. And I remind you, the Russians are the ones who are in the driver's seat when it comes to the military affairs, and it is an absolutely stupid discourse in Europe to say that, oh, we need to think about how to secure Ukraine once the war is over and deter Russia from attacking again. Guys, Europeans, please. Ukraine is being grinded down. It is in a war right now. It is utterly ridiculous to think about how to save the patient in the future if the patient dies now. This is absolutely dumb. Um, and that's the first dumb thing. The second dumb thing is to say that Ukraine needs to have these. There needs to be security guarantees with Ukraine. If the Europeans were serious about the security guarantees and the Americans serious, they would just announce it. There's nothing that keeps the state from saying, if Russia goes beyond point X, then we will invade. We will counter invade. You don't need an agreement with Ukraine for that, if you were serious. And this is, by the way, also how historically states give security guarantees not to the neutral country, but to the respective other party. And I give you the example of Belgium in in the 19th century, in the 1870s, in 1872 or 73, when the war between Germany and France was about to break out. They were always quarreling about the Alsace and Lorraine, right? And when they were like again about to fight a war, the Brits made an agreement with the Germans that if the French invade neutral Belgium, then the Brits would go to war with the French against the Germans. And they made the same copy paste, the same agreement on 2 days later with the Germans, saying like, if the French attack neutral Belgium to attack you, then we will go to war against the French with you. They made a dual treaty with both parties. And neutral Belgium, that's of course a security guarantee to neutral Belgium, but neutral Belgium wasn't involved. It was neutral. It had no security. It had nothing to say in this process. And the same is true today. If the West was serious, they could have already joined in the fighting. Ukraine doesn't need to be a NATO member for the Western states to declare war on Russia in order to go to war with Ukraine against Russia. But that's not what they want. And so they are engaged in this facade, in this kabuki theater, where they make you believe that, oh, we need these agreements, and Ukraine needs to be allowed to have this security agreement with us in order to be safe, blah blah blah. No, if you were serious, you would just do it. You would just say it and promise it amongst each other, and then implement it. But you're not serious. You are fighting a proxy war. You're part of the proxy war machine, and therefore you have to engage in these empty speech acts in order to signal to your own population. The European leaders are playing to their own population to pretend that they're working on a political settlement of the conflict, when what they're doing is just making sure that it continues. So it's all just kabuki theater at this point.
Remains to be seen what happens in the Russia-Ukraine war.